Welcome to No Longer Conformed. I'm Erik Garthe, and we are studying the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, the world upside down. In this session, we'll be looking at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, a model of service. As a Christian, your past doesn't matter. It has been redeemed by the blood of Jesus Christ. It is important to live well and die well for him. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. That verse declares that empty preaching leads to empty faith, but in the first verse of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul claims the opposite. Verse 1 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, for you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. Bold words, yet in the 12 verses of this chapter, Paul gives the secret to success as a servant of Jesus Christ. Let's look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 to 12, and let's see three expressions of Christian service. First, Christian service is expressed in unselfish love. Verses 1 through 4. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain, but even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. Think about selfishness for a moment. We want our needs met first. We want our pain stopped now. We want our desires fulfilled. We want our way immediately. And with this selfishness, we resist God's place at the center of our heart, in the center of our lives. Paul's love didn't worry about self or about personal comfort. Verse 2, but even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. Acts chapter 16, verses 16 to 40, records the treatment that the mission team received in Philippi. Paul hadn't forgotten that incident, and yet he kept on preaching the gospel. That was not natural courage. It was supernatural boldness. Notice for a moment the positive qualities of unselfish Christian love. It's a love of truth. Verse 3, for our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit. Assurance of the gospel was not based in error. The salvation message, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is true. An appeal of the gospel was not uncleanness, as many pagan religions offered sexual acts as attraction. The advance of the gospel was not through deceit, like some religions which caught their followers with bait. The word exhortation refers to persuasive speech, motivated by the very truth of Calvary's cross. Many Christians today do not have this love of the truth, and that's why they find it so hard to witness to the lost. Second, it's a love of the task, verse 4 again. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. Paul loved his work, that of seeing lives changed. He speaks of God's calling and God's blessing. This was the apostles' simple claim to a calling to ministry. There's a temptation common to preachers of desiring to be pleasing. The problem is that people are fickle, and what satisfies is ever-changing. So at the end of the day, it's only God's approval that matters. 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 5 tells us, therefore judge nothing before the time, until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the heart. Then each one's praise will come from God. So first, Christian service is expressed in unselfish love. Second, Christian service is expressed in unselfish labor. Verse 5 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness. God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. So, affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring day and night, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. Apparently, there's a charge made against Paul of self-interest, which is worse than trying to please people. This sin is always fatal. So the apostle argued that his labor was fully unselfish, free of three things that we see in verses 5 and 6. Unselfish labor is free of flattering words, using acceptable speech to gain something. It was free also of unselfish labor, which is free of covetousness, a desire for money or for self-promotion. It was also free of unselfish labor by being free of self-glorying. Paul did receive honor from men, but he never looked for it. Instead, look at verses 8 and 9. Unselfish labor is willing, affectionately desirous. What was Paul's secret for maintaining effectiveness? Unreserved abandon, continual and selfless giving of himself to people whom he loved dearly. Look at verse 9 again. For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring day and night, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. Back in verse 6, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. Paul did voluntary ministry motivated by selfless love. He didn't do it, listen, Paul did not do voluntary ministry in order to develop a doctrine of bivocational ministry. That's great when ministers are bivocational and are able to do it and freely do it for the church. But there's not a bivocational doctrine in Paul's teaching. In the spiritual life, being preoccupied with self is the greatest barrier to seeing the many ways of service. Often new ways. We or I never did it that way before, and never will, some will say. John Scully was president of PepsiCo in 1982 when Apple Computer co-founder Steve Jobs asked him, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want to change the world?" Do we Christians really want to impact the world for Christ? Well, we may have to do things a little differently in methods. The message never changes. The message of the cross is the same, and God uses the foolishness of preaching to save. But methods do change based on the context. And then third, Christian service is expressed in unspotted living. Look at verse 10. You are a witness, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. As you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. A Christian should live so that his life will withstand a close inspection according to the standard of Christ. Verse 10 describes Paul's life in 3 words: devoutly, justly, and blamelessly. The apostle declared, "You are witnesses, and God also." Devoutly is a man's conduct toward God. Justly is a man's conduct toward others. Blamelessly is a man's private conduct. Paul could lay his head on his pillow at night without guilt in his relationships with God, with others, and himself. In verse 11, he moved on to practice what you preach. He said, as you know. And then he stated 3 phases of ministry to other Christians. We exhorted and comforted and charged everyone. Exhorted is a passionate appeal. Comforted is an awareness of the circumstances. And charged is uncompromised firmness. The message comes together in verse 12. Read it again. It's the proof of Paul's ministry, the testimony of his converts, that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. The secret of success in ministry is selflessness. You have a great day.